The night Sarah Voss threw herself in front of 5 arrows meant for the Alpha King's mother, she did not think of glory or gratitude or the debt a king might owe a girl from the border provinces. She thought only of the small, silver-haired woman who had pressed a wildflower into her palm 2 days earlier and called her by her name, not her rank, not her function, not the polite fiction of her title, just her name. What Sarah did not know, as the first arrow punched through her shoulder and the second found the space between her ribs, was that the king had been watching from the tree line for the past 3 minutes, frozen by something he could not yet name, a hum, low and insistent, that had begun in his chest the moment she stepped into the courtyard that morning and had not stopped since. She went down on her knees. She did not let the Queen Mother fall. If you feel this story is already pulling at something inside you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. More stories are coming. The border provinces of Ashenvale were not the kind of place that produced heroes. They produced survivors. People who understood that the soil gave only what you forced it to, that winter arrived early and left late, and that the central nobility in the capital city of Varnhall considered the border territories a useful buffer, expendable, necessary, and easily forgotten. Sarah Voss had understood all of this since she was 9 years old, when she had stood in the village square and watched the king's tax collector ride through without slowing. She was 23 now, and her understanding had not softened. It had simply become quiet, the way a stone is quiet, useful when thrown, otherwise still. She had not expected to be summoned. The letter had come on a morning like any other, bearing the royal seal and the particular condescension of formal address. Sarah Voss, border healer, 3rd class, you are requested to attend the Palace of Varenhall in the capacity of temporary medicinal consultant. Duration not to exceed 30 days. She had packed her herbs and her bone-handled knife and the worn leather satchel that had belonged to her mother and had not let herself wonder what it meant. Wondering was how you got hurt. Varenhall was everything Ashenvale was not. White stone and banners the color of deep water, streets so clean they seemed polished, servants who moved with the efficiency of water finding its level. Sarah had arrived dusty and road-sore and had been escorted immediately to the Eastern Healing Wing without any ceremony at all, which suited her perfectly. She had a room barely larger than a closet and a workbench that smelled of old tinctures, and she thought, with a grim private satisfaction, that she could manage 30 days of this and go home with her dignity intact. She had not accounted for the Queen Mother. Elise Varenkopf was 62 years old and moved through the palace like a woman who had been installed there before the stone was set, which was not far from the truth. She had outlasted a brutal husband, a border war, and 3 assassination attempts with her warmth essentially undiminished, which Sarah found both impressive and slightly alarming. On the second morning of Sarah's posting, Elise had wandered into the healing wing without announcement, examined Sarah's work table with bright, curious eyes, and asked 3 precise and surprisingly technical questions about the properties of marsh willow bark. They had talked for 2 hours. Elise had pressed a sprig of pale gold wildflower into Sarah's palm as she left and said, quietly and without flourish, you have a healer's hands and a soldier's eyes, Sarah Voss. I hope someone has told you that recently. No one had. No one had ever told her that. She had not let herself think too hard about why it mattered. The evening of the 5th day, Sarah was in the east courtyard gathering late-season herbs from the kitchen beds when she heard the gates. Not the main gates, the servants' passage, narrow and largely unwatched. She looked up. 3 figures, dark-cloaked, moving with the deliberate quietness of people who did not want to be heard. Her healer's instincts flagged it as wrong before her mind assembled the full picture. Then she heard a fourth sound, soft footsteps from the colonnade to her left, and understood with cold clarity that someone was walking Elisa Varenkov through the courtyard on her evening constitutional, which she took every fifth day at this exact hour, which meant someone had told the figures at the gate precisely when to arrive. Sarah did not think. She moved. She put herself between the Queen Mother and the first arrow before the bowstring finished its snap, and the pain of it, white, sudden, enormous, hit her like a wave and passed through her, and she was still standing. The second arrow caught her in the side. The third grazed her arm. She turned her body, pressing Elise behind her, and heard the old woman's sharp intake of breath and said, with all the calm she had spent 23 years cultivating, "Stay behind me, Your Grace. Please don't move." The fourth arrow was the one that almost broke her. It went deep. She felt something shift and knew, with the pragmatic clarity of a healer, that it had found something important. She was still standing. She would stand until she couldn't. The fifth arrow never reached her. It stopped in midair. The courtyard went very still. Sarah blinked blood from her eye and looked toward the tree line, and what she saw there, what stood there, 7 feet of barely leashed fury with eyes that had gone the particular silver gold of a wolf in full emotional shift, and hands that had extended outward and simply stopped the arrow through the sheer brute force of a king who had crossed the last 40 meters of that courtyard in a span of time that should not have been physically possible, was Aldrich Varenkov, and he was not entirely himself. The 3 figures at the gate made one attempt to flee. They did not succeed. Sarah did not watch what happened to them. She was focused on not falling, which was becoming increasingly difficult, and on the soft, terrified sound of Elise behind her, and on the absurd, mundane observation that the herb she had been cutting when this started was still in her left hand. She heard him reach her before she saw him, felt the air change, warm, scent of pine and winter cold, and something under both that her body recognized in a way her mind hadn't yet caught up to. His hands found her before she hit the ground. Both of them. One at her back, one at her ribs, careful in a way that seemed incongruent with the expression she caught a glimpse of before her vision began to blur. Something shattering, something that had no word for it in the language she'd grown up speaking. Stay awake. Low, rough, a command so absolute it felt like a hand around her wrist. Sarah, stay awake. She thought, with distant amusement, that he knew her name. She hadn't known that he knew her name. She woke in the healing wing, which was appropriate. Her own workbench was visible from the bed, and her satchel had been hung on the hook by the door, and there were 2 palace healers standing at the far wall, looking exhausted and a little frightened, which was less appropriate. It was night. A single lamp burned on the bedside table. And sitting in the chair beside her bed, still in his courtyard clothes, with his elbows braced on his knees and his face in his hands in the posture of a man who had been sitting like that for a very long time, was Aldrich Varenkov. Sarah said nothing for a moment. She took inventory of her body the way she always did, methodically, without fuss. Shoulder, bandaged, deep, would need weeks. Side, same. Arm, minor. The fourth wound, the important one, packed tightly, a healer's work. Good work, she noted professionally, and then noticed that her own instruction manual for that specific type of wound was sitting open on the workbench, and understood, with a complicated feeling, that someone had used her own notes to tend to her. You should sleep. She meant to sound practical. Her voice came out softer than she'd intended. He looked up. She had seen Aldrich Varenkov twice in her 5 days at court, both times at the formal distance of a public function. She had formed the impression of a man built for the role he occupied, large, controlled, the kind of handsome that was architectural rather than pretty, a jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically for holding things in. She had not formed any other impression because she was 23 years old and from the border provinces, and she was not in the habit of forming impressions of kings. The man looking at her now was not that man. Or rather, he was that man with something removed, the outer architecture still standing, but something inside it cracked open, and the light coming through the cracks was warm and terrible and made it very difficult to look directly at him. He reached out. His fingers found her hand, the one lying still on the blanket, and closed around it, and he did not say anything for a long moment. And then he said, "Why?" Not a question. Not quite. She pressed a wildflower into my palm. Sarah's voice was very quiet. She called me by my name. Something crossed his face. She watched it move through him the way a current moves under still water, invisible from the surface, measurable only by what it brought to shore. And then, without any of the control she had catalogued as his defining characteristic, Aldrich Varenkopf bent his head over her hand and broke. She had not expected that. She suspected he hadn't either. His shoulders shook once, twice, silent, contained, the grief of a man who had not let himself feel something and had just been overtaken by it. She lay very still and let him, because she was a healer, and she understood that some things needed to pass through a person without interference, and because something in her chest, that hum, that warmth, that thread she had been carefully not acknowledging since the first morning in the courtyard, pulled tighter and ached with it. She lifted her free hand, the uninjured one, and set it in his hair. Just that. No words. He stilled. Didn't pull away. Outside the window, the palace was very quiet. She was confined to the healing wing for 9 days, which suited no one. Sarah was not, by temperament, a good patient. She knew exactly what she should and should not be doing for each of her injuries, and this knowledge made her simultaneously the best and worst candidate for enforced rest, because she understood precisely how much she was being reasonable and precisely how much she was not. She wrote it down once, the tally, and then burned the paper. Aldrich came every day, not at a scheduled time, not announced, not with the ceremony of a formal visit. He simply appeared, usually in the late afternoon, in clothes that suggested he had come from some other task and rerouted without entirely meaning to. He brought things, not flowers, not the standard courtly offerings. Her herb book, the second volume, which she'd left in the East Garden, a specific tea she'd mentioned once in passing, a wooden chair, a better one, which he carried in himself without asking anyone to do it for him, and set beside the workbench without comment. The palace healers did not know what to do with this. Elise knew exactly what to do with it. She arrived on the 3rd day, sat beside Sarah's bed, and talked for an hour about botany and provincial trade routes and the particular difficulty of growing frost mint at altitude, and then, as she was leaving, paused in the doorway and said, without turning around, "He hasn't slept, you know. He sat in that chair your first night here until past 3 in the morning. I had to send Rowan to make him eat." Rowan, Sarah said carefully, is his steward. And his oldest friend, a deeply sensible man who has been trying to get Aldrich to slow down for 9 years. Elise turned then, and her expression was gentle and very clear. "You are the first thing in 9 years that has made him stop." Sarah looked at the floor. The hum in her chest, the one she had been carefully filing under coincidence and stress and altitude adjustment and a dozen other rational explanations, throbbed once, distinctly. "I'm from the border provinces," she said. "I know where you're from." Elise said it warmly, without implication, the way someone says the sky is blue. I know what that means in this court. I know what people will say. A pause. I also know what I watched happen in that courtyard. My son crossed 40 meters in 4 seconds, Sarah. He hasn't moved that fast since his wife died. She let that land. I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you what I saw. She left. Sarah sat with it for a long time, the way you sit with something heavy, testing its weight, deciding whether to carry it or set it down. Aldrich arrived at his usual time, an hour later. He carried her 3rd volume. She had not asked for it. He set it on the workbench and did not make anything of it, and she watched him settle into the wooden chair he had brought and open the visiting log he always pretended to be reading during these hours. She had noticed weeks ago that he never turned a page, and she said, without looking at him, "Your mother told me about your wife." The room held its breath. Lysa. His voice was very level. She died 4 years ago. A fever that moved too fast. A pause. I was in the Northern Territory. Council business. I didn't make it back in time. Sarah said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help. She would have liked you, he said, finally. She was always correct about people. Faster than me. Something almost like a smile. Brief. Complicated. Real. She would have said you were the most stubborn person in the Eastern Wing, and she would have meant it as a compliment. She would have been right, Sarah said. He looked at her then, and the hum between them tightened to the point where it was almost a sound, almost something the room itself could hear, and neither of them moved. And she thought this is the moment that changes things. She could feel its shape, the exact weight of it, and then the door opened, and Rowan appeared with the tray of evening tea, and the expression of a man who was extremely sorry for the timing, and also not sorry at all because he had clearly been sent on purpose. She met Aldrich's eyes. His mouth twitched. "Rowan," he said, without looking away from her. "My lord." The steward set the tray down with great dignity. "Your tea. You could have knocked." "I did knock, my lord. You didn't hear me." Rowan poured the tea with an expression of perfect serenity. "I'll give you my full report in the morning." He left. The door closed. Aldrich looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who had spent 9 years being managed by someone he fundamentally respected. And then he turned back to Sarah, and the almost smile had become something warmer and more unguarded, and she felt it settle somewhere in her ribs, careful and tender as a new bruise. She was cleared for movement on the 9th day. Her shoulder ached in the cold, and the wound in her side would be a scar she'd carry forever, which she accepted with the equanimity of a healer who had always known that the body keeps its own records. She resumed her duties in the healing wing. Her 30 days were technically half spent. No one mentioned her leaving. The attack investigation had moved fast, in the way that palace investigations move when the king is personally invested and also barely sleeping. Rowan had briefed her on the 4th day, not because she'd asked, but because he'd looked at her steadily and said, "You were in the courtyard. You have a right to know," and she had found she liked him enormously. The 3 bowmen were border-hired mercenaries. They pointed to their employer with very little resistance, which was either a sign of poor professional discipline or of something more deliberate. Men offered up to carry the investigation only so far. The name they gave was Lord Castor Vane, a senior member of the King's Advisory Council, a man who had been stationed at Aldrich's right hand for 6 years, and who had been visibly, carefully outraged at every step of the investigation, loud in his support, public in his grief, a performance so practiced it had apparently been convincing, until Rowan started pulling the financial records. Lord Vane was the kind of man who had spent 30 years learning to be indispensable. He had survived the old king, smoothed the transition to Aldric's reign, and positioned himself as the one voice in the room who could always be trusted to prioritize the kingdom's stability over sentiment. He was elegant, measured, and genuinely brilliant, and he had been quietly bleeding money from 3 border provinces for 11 years through a series of tax diversions so layered that the actual theft looked, at surface level, like administrative error. Elise Varenkov had started to notice the pattern 2 months ago. She had told her son, and Castor Vane had learned of that conversation within 24 hours because he had informants who had been in place for years, because he was thorough, because that was who he was. The bowmen in the courtyard had not been aimed at the Queen Mother out of cruelty. They had been aimed at her because she was the one person in the palace who had already identified him, who had written down what she'd found, who would not be easily discredited. Vane had done the math and moved. Sarah absorbed all of this sitting on her workbench while Rowan stood near the door and watched her with thoughtful eyes. "He didn't know about me," she said. "No, you were an inconvenience, a border healer who happened to be present and happened to survive." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "He knows about you now, of course. You're rather more notable than you were." She looked at her hands. "He's still on the council." For another 36 hours, the formal charges are being prepared. Rowan paused. The king wanted to move faster. I counseled him against it. Evidence first. A beat. He was not easy to counsel. She could imagine. She had seen what Aldric's face looked like when something he cared about was threatened, had seen it in the courtyard, had felt it in the grip of his hands in the healing wing. She thought about what it must have cost him to hold still, to move through formal process, to do this the right way, and she felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with her injuries. "He listens to you," she said. Sometimes Rowan's expression was dry and fond in equal measure. Less than before, lately he's distracted. She did not ask by what. She already knew by what. Vane was arrested at the council table on a Wednesday morning. Sarah heard about it from the kitchen girls, who heard about it from the guards, who said that the king had let Rowan read the charges aloud rather than doing it himself, which was either a gesture of procedure or a gesture of restraint. And that Vane had sat through all of it with the expression of a man who had always known this was coming and had simply hoped it would come later. He had not protested. He had not performed. He had looked at Aldric once, at the end, with something that might have been genuine regret, and Aldric had not looked away, and that was the end of 30 years of trust between them. He came to the healing wing that evening later than usual. Sarah was at her workbench, which she no longer needed to use as an excuse for anything, and she heard him come in and did not turn around. "Are you all right?" she asked. A long pause. "I'm not sure what I am." She turned. He was leaning in the doorway, not quite in the room, in the particular posture of a man who has held himself together through a very long day and is not entirely confident he can hold himself together through what comes next. His jaw was tight. His eyes were tired in a way that went deeper than the surface. She put down her herb knife and crossed the room and stood in front of him, and she looked up at him. He was nearly a foot taller, which she had catalogued academically weeks ago and now registered as something entirely different, and she said, "He was your friend." "Yes, that's allowed to hurt." He looked at her for a very long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I spent the entire proceeding thinking about something else. Someone else." His hand came up, slowly, and found her jaw, the lightest of touches, a question and not a demand. "I'm not sure what that makes me." "Human," she said. He kissed her before she finished the word. Careful, then less careful, one hand at her jaw and one at her waist, and the warmth in her chest expanding outward, until it was everywhere, until it was the whole room. And she found his shoulders with her hands and leaned into him and let it happen. Let herself stop filing things under rational explanations. The hum between them was no longer a question. It never really had been. He pulled back first, pressed his forehead to hers. "Breathed, Sarah," he said. Just that. Just her name. And the way he said it made her understand what Elise had meant about being called by your name by someone who meant it. "I know," she said. "I know." The next 3 weeks were the strangest of her life, and she had lived through a drought year and a fever outbreak, and the specific ongoing strangeness of being a woman with no family connections, doing a man's work in a place that considered both of those facts to be politely unfortunate. This was different. This was the palace adjusting to a fact it had not anticipated, with all the grace and subtlety of a very large ship changing course, slowly, noisily, with various things rattling in the hold. The court had opinions. Most of them were expressed sideways, in the language of courts everywhere, a pointed pause, a deliberately incomplete introduction, the careful social distance of people deciding which side of something they were on. Sarah absorbed all of it without comment, because she was from the border provinces and she had been absorbing things without comment her whole life, and because she understood that this was not actually about her, but about what she represented, the disruption of an arrangement that had suited a great many people for a very long time. Lady Vesa Armant had opinions that were less sideways. She had been the most senior noble daughter at court for 4 years, had been present at every function, had positioned herself with remarkable precision as the obvious choice for whenever the king decided to stop grieving and look forward. She was intelligent and beautiful and had been preparing for this particular role with the dedication of someone who genuinely believed preparation was the same as inevitability. The first time she met Sarah face to face, she looked at her the way you look at an arithmetic error, as something that should not be possible, and probably wasn't. A border healer, she said, at a court gathering that Sarah had attended only because Elise had quietly requested her presence. "How remarkable that you've made such an impression." "I've been told I'm difficult to ignore," Sarah said pleasantly. I think they meant it critically. Something flickered behind Vesa's eyes, recalculation, rapid and visible. She inclined her head and moved away, and Sarah thought, with a healer's instinct for patterns, that the conversation was not over, that Vesa Armant was not the kind of woman who moved away because she was finished. She was right. 3 days later, a letter arrived in the healing wing addressed in Vesa's script. It was polite, brief, and contained a very specifically placed observation about the dangers of foreign substances in medicines prepared by border practitioners without full palace vetting. It was not a threat. It was the shape of one. Sarah sat with it for 10 minutes. Then she took it to Rowan. He read it twice, his expression not changing in any visible way, which she had come to understand was his tell. "You're not going to take it to the king," she said. "I was considering it." "Don't. Not yet," she thought. She's testing. She wants to see if I panic and go straight to him. If I do, she knows the dynamic and she'll adjust. Rowan looked at her with the expression he sometimes wore when she said something that rearranged his expectations slightly. "I'd like to handle this myself." "How?" "Give me 2 days." He did. Sarah spent those 2 days quietly, doing her work, keeping her hours, and also, because she was a healer, and healers paid attention to what was actually wrong, finding out everything she could about Vesa Armant's youngest sister, who had been quietly absent from court for 3 months, with an illness that had been described vaguely as a nervous complaint by everyone Sarah asked. She found the girl on the 3rd morning. 17 years old, pale, frightened, genuinely unwell in a way that had been masked and medicated into a kind of manageable concealment rather than actually treated. Sarah spent an hour with her, not as an investigator, just as a healer. The girl cried twice. By the end, she was eating something and had agreed to a daily examination. Vesa found her in the corridor afterward. Her expression had shifted from its court-perfect composure into something younger and more real, and for a moment, Sarah simply looked at it. "She's going to be all right," Sarah said, "if she's properly treated. She has been badly managed, but that's fixable." Vesa said nothing for a long moment. Something was happening in her face that she was clearly accustomed to not allowing to happen. "She's been afraid to tell anyone," Vesa finally said. "I know." Sarah kept her voice level. "She's not anymore." The letter was not followed by another one. Vesa Armont was cool towards Sarah for another week, and then, gradually, with the particular grace of an intelligent woman, revising a fixed position. She was not. She did not become warm. She became something more interesting, quietly respectful, the respect of someone who had tested something and found it held. The formal accusation of Castor Vane brought other things to light. 2 of his informants within the palace staff had been identified through the financial records, which was methodical and expected. The third was not identified through records at all. It was identified through Elise. She came to Sarah's workbench on a quiet morning, her usual warmth carrying something else underneath it, a specific quality of controlled fear, of someone who has worked something out and would rather not have. "My personal secretary," she said, without preamble. "Maret, she has been with me for 8 years. Sarah put down what she was holding. "I've been thinking about who knew my schedule. The courtyard walk. I keep it irregular. I don't announce it. I don't record it in the public calendar." Elise's voice was very steady. "Maret handles my private calendar. She is the only person who would have known which 5th day I would walk and at what hour." A silence. The heating unit in the wall made a small sound. Outside the window, a bird called once. "Have you told Aldrich?" Sarah asked. "I've come to you first." Elise looked at her, and the expression was complicated and deliberate, "because I am going to ask you something that I have no right to ask." She waited. "I want to understand before the king's investigators do. I want to know why." Elise folded her hands in her lap. "Maret has a daughter. 6 years old. If Maret is taken by the king's guard, the child has no one." A pause. "I am not asking you to intercede with the law. I am asking you to help me understand whether there is a reason to make the case for mercy." Sarah thought about this for a long moment. About what it meant to be asked, about what Elise was actually saying under the words. "I'll talk to her," Sarah said. She found Maret in the late afternoon, alone in the Queen Mother's corridor, and the woman looked at her with eyes that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time, the way people wait for the specific thing they have dreaded most. She was 40, tired, and had clearly been frightened for weeks. Sarah sat across from her and said, quietly, "Tell me about your daughter." She told Rowan everything. Not the conversation itself, which was Maret's, but the shape of it, a woman who had been given a choice between her employer's safety and her child's life, who had been told that the child was being held against her compliance, who had cooperated with Vane's network out of the particular specific terror of a parent who has no other leverage. Maret had not told her daughter's location even under that pressure. She had protected what she could and destroyed what she couldn't. The girl was found in the border town Vane had named, looked after by a neighbor who had no idea she was involved in anything. She was returned to Varenhall within 4 days, at Aldrich's personal order, which came down with unusual speed. Maret was formally charged and formally shown mercy, exile from palace service, a pension for 3 years, and a clear record for the child. The king announced the mercy publicly. At court, in the particular way that public announcements are made when the person making them wants to establish a precedent, Sarah stood at the edge of the hall and listened to it and felt the hum in her chest pulse warm and steady. The autumn festival at Varenhal was a mating ball, which was a word Sarah had never encountered in actual practice before. In the border provinces, people who wished to formalize a bond did so at the local magistrate's office over a piece of paper and whatever witness happened to be nearby. There was not a ball involved. There was not a mask. There was certainly not a tradition in which the Alpha King circled the floor 3 times and then stood in the center and waited, which was apparently the signal that he had found someone, that the choice had been made, that the court could now do whatever it wished with the information. She had found this out from the kitchen girls, who had found it deeply romantic. Elise had looked at her across the breakfast table when Sarah relayed this fact and said, mildly, "And you're wearing the blue, I hope." She wore the blue. She had not expected to feel anything at the ball except out of place. She had spent 23 years being out of place in one context or another, and she was reasonably skilled at it by now, the specific art of being somewhere that was not built for you and maintaining your equilibrium. But there was something about the masked crowd, the music that moved through the old stone the way the first warmth of spring moves through frozen ground, that made her equilibrium harder to locate than usual. And then she felt him before she saw him, the particular warmth and scent and rightness that she had stopped pretending to explain away, and she turned, and he was there. He had found her immediately. She suspected he always would. They danced, or rather, he danced, and she followed, and at some point the distinction stopped mattering. He was not what she would have guessed in this specific context, lighter on his feet than his size suggested, with a quality of attention in his hands that made it feel less like a formal court dance and more like a private conversation. He said nothing for the first 3 passes of the floor. Then, very quietly, against her temple, "Do you know what I'm about to do?" "I've been briefed," she said, "by approximately 6 people." She felt him almost laugh, which was its own kind of warmth. "Sarah, just that." "I know what it means." She looked up at him. "I know what it means in this court too. I know you do." He stopped them in the center of the floor, and the music kept playing around them, and the court went very quiet in the particular way that courts go quiet when they understand that something is happening that they will be talking about for a long time. "I'm asking anyway." "You're not asking," she said. "I'm asking." She looked at him for a moment, the controlled face with the warmth coming through the cracks, the jaw that held things, the eyes that were doing something they hadn't done until he walked into her healing wing and picked up her wooden chair without asking, and she said, "Yes, all right. Yes." He pressed his forehead to hers, right there in the center of the floor, for 3 full seconds, with no ceremony at all, just the 2 of them, and the court could make of that whatever it wished. What it wished, as it turned out, was to start clapping. This was also not something Sarah had anticipated. She looked sideways and found Rowan at the edge of the floor, and his expression was so carefully neutral over such evident relief that she nearly laughed. Vesa Armand stood near the eastern wall and inclined her head once, precise and meaning it, and Sarah inclined hers back. Elise, somewhere in the middle of the crowd, was crying. She wasn't trying to stop. The claiming ceremony was held 11 days later in the old tradition, a dawn ritual in the sacred grove at the edge of the palace grounds, where the ancient oaks had been growing since before the stones of Varenhal were laid. Sarah had expected more of the court's ceremonial weight, more formality and observation. What she found instead was small: Aldrich, Elise, Rowan, and the old grovekeeper who maintained the rites, the particular quality of early morning light through old leaves, the sound of water from the creek below. Aldrich spoke the words of the claiming in the old tongue. Sarah had learned them in the 3 days prior, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she understood that certain things were meant to be met, and she met them. She spoke them back. He pressed his mouth to the curve of her neck and shoulder, gentle, deliberate, a warmth that blossomed outward into her blood and bones, and that thread in her chest pulled taut and held, and she understood in a way that the rational part of her had been slowly approaching for weeks, but had not quite arrived at until this exact moment. This was the bond completing. This was what it felt like. Like coming to rest. She tilted her head back into his hand and heard him exhale against her skin and felt the warmth of it everywhere and thought, quietly and without ceremony, "Yes, there you are." Rowan handed her a small thing, a carved wooden figure, rough-hewn and clearly very old, a wolf sitting with its head lifted. She looked up at him. He said, very simply, it was his wife's. He wanted you to have it. He asked me to give it to you, because he couldn't, a pause. He wasn't sure of the words. She held it carefully. She looked at Aldrich. He was watching her with that expression, the one with the warmth coming through, and she thought about Lysa, who had been correct about people, and about wildflowers pressed into palms, and about an arrow that had stopped in midair. And she said, "I'll keep it safe. I know you will," he said. There was one thing still unfinished. Sarah had known it was unfinished, the way she always knew things were unfinished, a healer's instinct for what had not yet been discharged. Castor Vane was being held in the palace's East Tower, pending a full trial. He had been formally stripped of his council seat. His estate had been frozen. The financial records had been handed to 3 independent auditors. All of this was the machinery of justice doing what it was built to do, and she trusted it. What she did not trust was the thing the financial records had not explained. She brought it to Aldrich on a quiet evening, the way she brought most things, directly, without much preamble, because she had found that he preferred it, and she preferred it, and they were well matched in this. She sat across from him at his work table, which she now occupied freely and without ceremony, and she laid out what she had been assembling for 2 weeks. The money, she said. The diversion from the border provinces. Some of it was standard greed. But not all of it. She had the records in front of her, annotated in her own hand. These 3 columns don't go to any account Rowan's people have found. They go sideways, small amounts, irregular timing, the kind of pattern that looks like a counting error until you line it up against the relic trade calendar from the northern market. Aldrich was very still. "There's a relic," she said. Or there was. Something that can drain the bond, suppress it in someone who's been formally claimed. I found a reference to it in the 3rd strata records from your father's reign. Your mother's name appears adjacent to a purchase order that was never completed. She looked at him. Someone was trying to buy a way to break the bond between your parents. Not in your time. In your father's. Vane was continuing something that started 30 years ago. The silence in the room was very particular. "The relic," he said. "I believe it's here. In the palace." Hidden, she had the location narrowed, had been narrowing it for a week. I believe that's what Vane was actually protecting. The money was secondary. The relic was the leverage. He looked at her for a long moment. "You want to go tonight? I want to go now." He stood. "Then we go now." The sublevel of Varenhal's east wing had been sealed for 12 years, since a water intrusion had rendered it structurally suspect, and a secondary treasury had been built above ground to replace it. The seal was official, and the record was clean. The seal was also, as Sarah had discovered in the maintenance logs, repaired and re-signed by Castorvane's office 18 months ago, not the structural team. She had thought this was worth noting. The passage was narrow and cold and smelled of old stone and something else, a particular acrid sweet odor that she recognized from the texts, from the descriptions she had been reading with increasing focus for the past several days. She felt Aldrich's hand at her back as they moved through it, steady and grounding. The wolf in him was close to the surface. She could feel it in the quality of his attention, in the slight warmth of his palm, in the way he positioned himself precisely between her and the passage ahead. The relic was exactly where she'd calculated, a small stone chamber, a sealed chest of the old design, a lock that used a key she had not had until Rowan found it in Vane's private effects that morning and handed it to her without a word, because he had also been paying attention. The relic itself was wrong in the way that corrupted things are wrong, a quiet wrongness, like a note that is almost in tune but isn't quite. It was a disc of dark metal, etched with something that might have been very old script, and it radiated a cold that Sarah felt in her scars first, then in the bond mark at her shoulder, a pulling sensation that made her instinctively reach for Aldrich's arm. He closed his hand over hers instantly. The cold lessened. "Don't touch it," she said. "Either of us." She had brought the materials. She had read about what worked, what neutralized, rather than simply contained purified silver water and salt ash, the specific preparation that appeared in the oldest healing texts as a counter to corrupted metalwork. She was thorough. She prepared it correctly. When she poured it over the relic, what happened was this, a sound, low and resonant, like a string breaking. And then, silence, and then the cold simply stopped. The thing in the chest was, after a moment, just a disc of dark metal. Nothing more. She covered it. She would deal with the disposal properly in the morning, with witnesses and the correct authorities. For now, she simply stepped back and felt the bond in her chest settle and exhaled. Aldrich put both arms around her from behind, pressed his face into her hair. "You were going to do this alone," he said. "Not an accusation. If I hadn't been awake. You were awake." "Sarah," she covered his arms with hers, "I thought you might prefer to be involved." He laughed, low, real, the kind of laugh that had been rare in his life for a very long time and was becoming less so. She felt it against the back of her head and turned into him, and he held her in the cold dark of the old chamber, while the relic that had been aimed at his parents' bond, and then his, and then at his mother's life, sat neutralized in its chest, and she thought about how much of this had started with a wildflower pressed into her palm. "We should go back up," she said. "We should," he agreed. He did not move. "Aldrich, give me a moment." She did. 18 months later, the east wing of Varenhall had been rebuilt, structurally, this time with the correct team, and the sublevel had been cleared and properly catalogued, and the record of what had been found there had been added to the palace archives in Rowan's careful handwriting. Because Rowan's careful handwriting was the handwriting of record in Varenhall, and everyone understood this. The morning the last of the cataloging was complete, Rowan brought the final entry to Sarah's office, her office now, properly appointed, with a door that had her name beside it, and she signed it, and he tucked it under his arm and looked at her with his usual thoughtful expression. "You're not eating your breakfast," he said. She was, in fact, not eating her breakfast. She had been not eating her breakfast for 9 days running, which was a pattern she had been observing with professional detachment. "I'm aware," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a deeply perceptive man who had long since learned to let people arrive at things in their own time. "Shall I tell him?" "Tell him what?" What you've just worked out this morning. She looked at her breakfast. She thought about what she had worked out this morning, which she had in fact worked out several mornings ago and had been sitting with in the particular way that you sit with something enormous and try to find the right way to carry it. No, she said. I'll tell him. She found him in the Eastern training yard, where he spent his mornings when the council schedule allowed, running the drills he had maintained since before his kingship, because he was a man who believed a body should be kept honest, and the discipline of it had become, she thought, a way of keeping other things honest too. He saw her from across the yard and stilled immediately, in the way he always did when she appeared unexpectedly, that total attention, that readiness, 12 months of marriage, and he still moved toward her before he'd consciously decided to. She waited for him to reach her. What's wrong? He said, scanning her with a healer's eye, which she found both touching and slightly amusing. Nothing's wrong. She took his hand. I need to tell you something. He waited. His hand was warm around hers. She told him. His face moved through something she had no words for, a rapid sequence of things, wonder and fear, and a tenderness so acute it was almost physical, arriving finally at something she could only call overwhelmed in the best possible way. He pulled her in with both arms, not a kiss, just holding her, and she felt his breathing change against her hair. Sarah, he said. I know. Are you? Yes, I'm well. We're well. She said it clearly, because she understood he needed the specific words. Everything is as it should be. He held on for a long time. Around them, the training yard had gone tactfully quiet, the guards and sparring partners having found reasons to be occupied elsewhere, which was either sensitivity or self-preservation, and she suspected both. Against her hair, very quietly, I wasn't going to have this. I know, she said. I had stopped. He stopped. Started again. I thought that part of my life was over. She pulled back enough to look at him. He looked like he had in the healing wing that first night, with that cracked open quality, the warmth coming through everywhere. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the same gesture he had used when he kissed her for the first time, and he closed his eyes. It wasn't over, she said. It was just waiting. From the corridor that connected the yard to the main building, a sound. Small, determined footsteps. Mira, who was the daughter of one of the kitchen staff and had recently discovered the East Training Yard with the enthusiasm of someone who believed she had personally invented it, appeared around the corner with a wooden practice sword roughly her own height and no evident plan. She had also recently discovered the Queen and was under the impression that Sarah belonged to her in some complicated and non-negotiable way. Sarah, she announced with the particular confidence of a 4-year-old delivering important intelligence. Rowan said, there are cakes. Did he? He said you should have one because you're not eating. She examined Aldrich with the frank assessment of someone who had not yet learned to be politic. You should probably have one too. You look funny. I look funny, Aldrich said. Your eyes are wet. She said it with enormous compassion. That happens sometimes. Rowan says it's all right. Sarah started laughing, soft and helpless, and felt Aldrich's hand press warm at her back, and felt the bond in her chest steady and full and settled, and thought about 5 arrows in a courtyard and a wildflower pressed into, a palm and an arrow stopped in midair, and a wooden wolf carved by hands she'd never meet, and a relic dissolved in the old dark, and a letter that had become a life she had not known how to want until it was given to her by someone who called her by her name and meant it, and she looked down at Mira, who was waiting with patient urgency for an answer about cakes. All right, Sarah said. Cakes. Mira turned and marched back toward the corridor with the authority of someone who has accomplished her mission. Aldrich watched her go with the expression of a man whose world has just quietly expanded again, and then he looked at Sarah, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that the morning hadn't already said for them. There's a moment in this story that I keep returning to, the one in the healing wing on the first night, when Aldrich, this controlled and guarded king, simply breaks, and Sarah doesn't try to fix it or retreat from it. She just puts her hand in his hair and lets him have it. That kind of grace is harder than anything else she does in the whole story, including the 5 arrows. If you're still here and this one stayed with you even a little, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this coming, and I don't want you to miss them. And I'd love to know which moment landed hardest for you. Was it the courtyard, that first night in the healing wing, or the training yard at the end? Tell me in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.